Well, hello, and welcome to episode 13 of the barn door restoration. Last episode, I did the rear section of the front frame rails. I got these rails on and rebuilt the step-up section. This episode, I got the front sections roughed in. So the front frame rails on this were quite bad. Both of them needed to be replaced. I started on the right side because it didn't have all this extra detail. So this side, the frame rail was pretty bad. The top of it was completely shot. Bottom was very thin in spots and needed to have parts done. And then even the side had some holes rotted through it. So it was just easy to replace this whole piece. Now I decided to go with one piece of metal without cutting it for the angle and the bends. That requires a lot of stretch in that metal because those two flanges bend up. It had to pull apart, so I had to stretch that considerably. So what I wanted to do was actually roll the beam in here. If I was to do it again, I would have actually put a cut, bent it, and then made a piece to fill in the gap after and welded in. Only because this took a lot longer than I expected. It did come out really nice, and I'm very happy with how it come out, but it was a lot of work thinning all that metal out. I think it matches what it originally was a little better, because originally that metal was quite thin right there, because when it was stamped and pulled down, it had to stretch there also. So this side was pretty simple, just make a new piece that matched size of the old one and weld it in. I still have a bunch of holes to drill in it and stuff, but that later. So this side was considerably worse. This one was rotted back into the front beam support. And the inner structure that sits inside the frame that holds the front beam, the threaded sleeves that the front beam bolts into, the bottom flanges of that were rotted off. And then the front frame was in terrible shape. So this bulge is for the clutch pedal. And then there's also a cutout and then a reinforcement plate that bulges up that goes over the steering box. That was basically completely missing off mine. And it's kind of a complex organic shape that I could have replicated, but had no real way of knowing exactly what the dimensions were. So I'm very lucky someone sent me a donor piece of another bus that had the complex bits were perfect on it. It still needed to replace the flanges and stuff, but the flat metal was easy. It was the complex parts I didn't have. So in the end, I didn't have to make it. The part was sent to me was very usable. So I'm very happy to get that. So what I did to start with this is, like the rear section, I put a bunch of blocks of wood on a board to hold everything straight before I started cutting things up, fitting things. Another thing I did was there's a hole in the front of these frames. I'm not sure what that is for. It must have been through production because maybe for moving the frames around or something, because the frame rails on mine, both of them had the hole pulled a little bit. Like it had something in it and bent. And this one had the same thing. It was pulled a little bit. So, and when the vehicle's completely assembled, there's nothing here. Nothing goes in these holes. The bumper bracket goes below it, and then the front valance bracket comes out over that a bit. So nothing goes there. Nothing would actually be able to get in to bend it like that. So it looks like, I think maybe it was held at the factory and somehow it put a little bend in those. But anyway, that's what I use for alignment hole. So I put a pin in my board, actually a drill bit. I just drilled down, left it there, so I could line this one up in it. And then when I went to place this one in to fit everything, I could use the same hole, make sure it was in the correct spot. So to start with, I had to start replacing this front section where the beam bolts in. So the front beam is basically two pipes with the torsion bars inside, and it clamps in using two bolts and goes into these two notches. So they need to be basically perfect for that to clamp in nicely. So the right side was not damaged, so I used that as a pattern. And actually what I ended up doing is I had some cut-off discs that were exactly the right size to fit nicely in those two notches. So I clamped them to a piece of flat bar so they fit perfect, and used it on this side to make sure that this was exactly where it needed to be. So once that was in, replaced the flanges on the inner support, and then started to assemble this piece. Once I had this piece assembled, I media blasted it and put some zinc paint on it. I like to put zinc on anywhere I've media blasted over rust, just in case there's anything left in there. Zinc will neutralize it. So before I welded the front to the rear section together, I bolted them back in the jig, and I wanted to make sure that everything was level across, and that these were square. Also, these frame rails, the top is parallel with these rails, and it's exactly 100 millimeters higher. So by setting a straight edge across on there, it should be exactly 100 millimeters on this rail. So everything's worked out. Everything's actually went back in the spot good. I then tacked it on, and then I took it off to finish welding it, because it's a lot easier to weld when you can put it on a table and flip it around, get the best way. There's something to note on these. Well, how these were assembled is the inner storage box on the seat was assembled. These front suspension supports were spot welded into that. Then the frame rails are put on after, and they were plug welded into that support. And there's 5 plug welds, and they were very roughly welded in. All the weld on this is very rough, but they're particularly bad. So when I had to replicate 2 down here, I welded them pretty rough also, and didn't try to make a nice job. I think I got it pretty close. I think once this is painted, that no one will ever notice that those aren't original plug welds. They'll all kind of match. Something I'm doing with a lot of the welds, like the weld around this curved edge doesn't get finished, and I try to make it match the original weld, which is pretty rough. Some of the welds on this were extremely rough. Some in the back were really bad. So anyway, the front rails are pretty much done. I still have to finish the welds off. They're not perfect yet. There's a bunch of holes to drill, a bunch of T-nuts to weld in behind. So that stuff, I'll do that in between other jobs. So I guess that about covers everything for this episode. Next one, I'm going to start building some parts for back here. The outriggers, cross member, the inner frame rails, and get those parts made. Looking forward to working with the thinner gauge steel. That would be nice. Oh, keep watching for some video of the work being done, assembling these front parts. And well, thanks for watching.